However, in exchange for that freedom, you need to give back to your country. And rather than having a prayer where the imam spends his time talking about converting Americans to Islam and their children, talking about what he felt, and this is what the sermon was about last Friday. It was about how the moral decadence of America is going to be solved by Muslims. I'm not sure that that is a right strategy, let alone it actually portrays the Islam that I was taught. My Islam, there's different versions I'm sure, but the Islam that my family taught me is one that doesn't say that ours is supreme to any other faith, that feels that we're equal before God, and that we separate mosque and state and do not feel that we have to impose in this sense of unification as an ummah, as a political ummah, but rather simply as a personal faith between an individual and God. And I'm sorry, but the demonstration last week, yes, it was a demonstration of religious freedom, but when you talk about Muslim unity at the halls of the most impressive political symbol in America, it can't help but make a political statement to America. And I don't think that that's going to help in the war on, against radical Islamism. Because if you look at the core ideologies that are feeding this, it's political Islam. And until Muslims can recognize that we need to separate mosque and state and bring Islam through an enlightenment and a reformation process, just like Christianity separated the role of the Church of England in Europe, we are not going to solve the problem of terrorism. The FBI and Homeland Security are going to continue chasing their tails for years, as long as we do not separate mosque and state. So the problem is not terror. Now, of the 4 million Muslims that are in America, I have personally never met a Muslim that condones terrorism, but there are a percentage. Some studies have said 5 to 10%. But more important is, what's that slippery slope? That's the violent portion. There is an ideology of Salafism, which is to bring things back the way it was at the time of the Prophet. And that ideology looks at trying to create an Islamic state. Now, many Muslims in America say that we get our rights here as a minority, we follow the laws of the land. The more important test is what's being taught in the mosques about law. And if Muslims are a majority, what type of government are they teaching their children in Islamic schools around the country? This is what is virally spreading across the internet and feeds into the separatism that is part of political Islam. And some studies have shown that that includes 30 to 40% of Muslims that believe that the Islamic State in some utopian form is better than the secular Western state. So the three questions I thought we should answer with the members of Congress that are here today is, what is the role of our government servants in this issue, in engaging the Muslim community? What is the role of Muslims and Muslim communities? And what is the role of American citizens? Whether elected or appointed, I think our congressmen and congresswomen are, I ask them, I implore them to lead and not follow. One example of leadership was Congressman Wolf's speech on the floor about the problem with CAIR and many of its connections and its inability to condemn organizations by name that are affiliated and have been labeled as terrorist organizations. Has our nation become too afraid, too weak to dissect the political motivations of the enemy and the slippery slopes which threaten our nation? And if we can't address slippery slopes, we will not win this. We will not win the war of ideas. And yet, while many of the Muslim organizations correctly are standing up for the rights of Muslims, they're not replying and countering that with also a recognition of the responsibility that this is our problem. These hundreds of arrests that have happened since 9/11 are not a coincidence. There is a pre-modern concept in Islam that has yet to become postmodern. And until we modernize that and create a separation of mosque and state, you're going to see a continued chain of radical individuals. Government, and the other thing I'd ask our leaders and our politicians is that they should not fear the language of religion. We do fear the language of religion. And yes, there is some protection to that. It has been part of our establishment clause to separate church and state. And in recognition of that, many people, once you start talking about faith, they say, okay, it's your faith, we won't touch it. But what about when the security that threatens us, the security threat, wraps itself and cloaks itself in religion? Are we going to let that political movement infringe on our rights without addressing it? And this is why at our organization, at AIFD, we feel that Muslims can do both. We can address political Islam as a threat, but we can also cherish and lift up our spiritual faith and our belief in God and in the Quran in a faith. And Gordon, can I have in a way of respect. So what is the role of the Muslim community? I mentioned members of Congress. What is the role of Muslims? I think that we need to stop being the squeaky wheel about the Patriot Act, we just saw a letter that went out 3 days ago from Muslim advocates that told every Muslim in America not to talk to an FBI agent unless they have an attorney with them. Is this the message really that we need to be sending? That we will no longer engage any Homeland Security individuals unless we're represented by an attorney, and now it's become an antagonistic relationship between the Muslim community and every Homeland Security agent? I don't think that that's actually going to help Muslims in America. So the elephant in the room is, I think we need to start, and government needs to help us engage Muslim organizations that are willing to deal with our own problems. I look at it as a physician. If I had a patient come in with cancer, and I knew they've been smokers for their whole life, I would engage them with their disease, but I would also talk to them about what the etiologies are and about the fact that smoking led to that. And if I went to the community to talk to them, I would try to acknowledge, and look how long it took America to acknowledge that cigarettes cause cancer. This doesn't mean that every patient in America or every smoker is evil or whatever it is, but that is a cause and effect that needs to be discussed. And I think ultimately, until Muslims can recognize, just as Europe recognized that the mixture of church and state was problematic to our freedom and to the concepts of liberty, I think that they will not make any progress against they'll not make any progress against this threat. Ultimately, Muslim organizations, and for example, you'll see releases from groups that said they were unfairly tarred in the listing in the Holy Land Foundation trial as unindicted co-conspirators, but yet there's been no address of the ideology. The issue is not the Muslim Brotherhood as card-carrying members. The issue is the ideology of political Islam and the cooperation of many of these groups that say they speak for Muslims, but yet carry an ideology that will not criticize Sharia law and the way it stands for against apostasy, the way it stands against blasphemy laws, the way it stands against women's rights, and all these things. And I think if Muslims want credibility, and if we want to be respected equally, we need to stand for reform within our faith for laws that are still in the 15th and 16th century. I think Muslims need to also stop collectivizing our community as one unit. We are not one unit. And when you start talking about Muslims as a group, it may make sense in America because we're a minority. But yet when we speak against the Muslim Brotherhood in America, we said, oh, we're anti-Islam, etc. But then you go to Egypt, and there's a huge population of Muslims speaking against the Muslim Brotherhood. It's very common to speak against political Islam in Egypt because they know what happens when it gets control. It's very common to speak against political Islam in Saudi Arabia because they know what happens when the Wahhabis get control. But yet in America, if you speak against political Islam, you're identified as somehow being anti-Muslim, which is absurd. I think some of the most devout Christians that existed were our forefathers that spoke out against the Church of England and the power of the clerics. The obstacles to this, I'll leave you in the last 2 minutes here. The obstacles to groups like ours, I think, is the facilitation of government officials that facilitate groups and make them into tribal leaders for the Muslim community. I think it's a fear of error. Certainly when we talk about religion, I want to make sure I don't make any mistakes, but I'm human, I might. I think America sometimes always wants to blame itself and doesn't look to blame others. And I think Muslims need to do some self-reflection on what it is our theology teaches and whether we are contributing through the smoking, which is political Islam, through the slippery slope. But we've not had any tipping points, and most of the Muslims I meet agree with actually the principles that we put forth in our organization, but yet they feel that the pressure's not enough, so they don't need to bother themselves with these issues. The media has facilitated the victimization concept and has not pushed. I mean, everybody talked about how great the prayer was last week. I would have loved the Imam for just 5 minutes to talk about his responsibility to teach every Muslim he was talking to that political Islam is a danger to the West and to freedom.